We looked around the internet trying to find information on how to replace the clutch master cylinder on our Corolla. There wasn't much out there, so we had to do it the hard way. I filmed the process for an episode of Project Crunchyrolla, and when I was done I realized I had enough video to put together a tutorial. So here it is. Believe it or not, the first step in replacing the clutch master cylinder is removing the front seat. 4 bolts, 14 millimeters, take them out. I suggest you keep track of everything with some zip top bags and a Sharpie to label them. Everything in a baggie. Now take your seat out and stash it in a safe place, somewhere you're not liable to trip over it. I took this opportunity to vacuum under the front seat. Remove the speaker cover with a Phillips and put the screw back in where it came from so you can find it later. Remove the 2 screws holding the hood release. Move the release out of the way. Put the 2 screws back in the hole so you can find them later. Remove these 3 Phillips screws holding the lower plastic piece and bag them or hold on to them so you can put them back where they came from. Remove the 2 10mm bolts. Mine were only hand tight, and when I put them back in, I'll only tighten them up to about 5 foot-pounds. Next, we remove the 4 steering column support bracket nuts. I can only show you 2 because I either forgot to take the video or I lost it. Notice the red arrow. That is one of the 2 nuts I can't show you. There's another one on the other side. Remove all 4 nuts and bag them. Remove this electrical device. Wiggle it off the mounting tab and then set it aside. Remove the master cylinder nut and remember to bag it. Our 10mm socket on a wobble extension. Remove the 2 left side brake booster nuts. And this is where you need to start being careful. All of those stamped metal pieces have really sharp edges. Ask me how I know. That's the lower right side nut. It's a little bit tricky, but you can do it. And that brings us to the reason we had to pull the steering column, the upper right brake booster nut. I'd love to give you a better camera shot of this, but even with all the disassembly we've done, you can't see it. Put the 10mm socket on the extension and then slip it on the nut. Put the ratchet on and spin Satan's nut off. Okay. It's got a cotter pin right here on the side. We're just going to go ahead and pull that out. Cotter pin. Remove the cotter pin and the clevis pin and bag them both, because the new master cylinder does not come with these parts, and if you lose them, you're sunk. Now's the time to drain the hydraulic fluid. Either use the brake bleeder or crack the slave cylinder bleed nipple with a 10mm flare nut wrench and pump the fluid out with the clutch pedal. Remove the reservoir by using a 19mm socket. Back under the hood, let's get the master cylinder ready for removal. See that red arrow? That's the nut that holds the master cylinder on the chassis stud. Right now the brake booster is blocking access. This red arrow is the hydraulic hardline going down toward the slave cylinder. Take a 10mm flare nut tool and loosen it. Do not try to loosen this fitting with a regular 10mm wrench. Just trust me. Once it's loosened, you can use a regular 10mm. Use a small pry bar or a large flathead screwdriver and coax the brake booster away from the firewall about 3/4 of an inch. You'll feel the brake pedal spring pulling against you. Leave the pry bar in there, or use a spacer of some sort if you're using a flat blade. Use a 10mm box end wrench to remove the master cylinder nut. You should have just enough room between the firewall and the brake booster to get about a 1/16 of a turn on the wrench. You can try a ratcheting wrench, but mine wouldn't fit because the nut was too close to the master cylinder itself. Satan's other nut. Move the hydraulic line out of the way and remove the master cylinder. It's a two-handed job and there's very little room. And there you have it. One master cylinder. Now remove the master cylinder clevis and wiggle the new master cylinder into place. It's a bit fiddly because you have to hold the hydraulic hardline out of the way with one hand while you position it with your other hand. The hydraulic line is in the way once again. Okay, that should be enough. Okay, it's on. Remove the reservoir cover and the disc, because if we remove the reservoir, we'll have much better access to the master cylinder chassis nut. Again, use the 19mm socket to remove the reservoir fitting and put the reservoir with the other parts. Let's put the master cylinder nut back on. You can try to start it with your fingers like I did, or put a dab of grease on the nut and then put it in your box end wrench. Then tighten it up. I'm going to take a piece of blue tape and put it on there so that nothing dirty falls in there. I want to get these threads started by hand so that we're not stripping anything as we go in. Like I said, start the fitting by hand. You can use a regular 10mm wrench to thread it into snug, then tighten only with a 10mm flare nut wrench. 10mm flare nut to tighten it down. And there we go. Remove the blue painter's tape. Thread the reservoir fitting in by hand until the threads are engaged, then tighten with a 19mm socket. Drop that thing, whatever it is in, and put the lid on it. Back inside the car, we can wind the clevis back onto the push rod. You'll have to spin it in or out on the rod to get it to line up correctly with the hole in the clutch pedal arm. Start the master cylinder nut by hand. Once the threads are engaged, use a ratchet to run it in tight. Install the clevis pin and the cotter pin. Then tighten the jam nut on the back side of the clevis. Remember that blue electronic box we took off? Now's the time to slip it back on its mounting tab. Install and tighten the brake booster nuts in the reverse order of how you took them off. Let's get the steering column back where it belongs. Position the sport on these studs and then put the nuts on a few threads. There we go. Let's put a nut on each one of those so that they don't fall apart. I'm trying to keep my hands out of the way, but between the camera and the light, it's hard to do. Okay, we've got those nuts on as far as we can. Now we'll lift the steering column up and bolt in the front bracket. And that seems like it's pretty easy to do. Put that in as far as it'll go by hand. Okay, we're going to get the other side, we're going to load into a socket because it's kind of tough to get to it. And it does have a ground strap on it, so keep that in mind. You have to put the ground strap in. That went in very easy. Attempt to use the electric ratchet. The connector is a little bit tricky because it smashes in from the side like that. Reinstall the heater duct.
That creaking is the wind blowing outside.
So let's get our screws back out. After you have your screws in hand, go ahead and reposition the lower dash plastic piece and put the screws in. Remember, not too tight. Tighten up the two 10mm hex head screws. Remember not to over tighten them because the plastics are 35 years old and you don't want to crack them. So, hand tight should be good enough. These were only hand tight when it's... Now we'll put our hood latch in after we take the screws out. Pretty easy to see it from this side. And with getting the dash back together, we're almost there. You need to reinstall your seat. I'm not reinstalling mine. And then you'll have to bleed the clutch system out. It's not a hard job, but it will require a second human being to give you some help. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you did, give us a like. And if you want to see more content about the Corolla or the Celica, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We do appreciate it. And our Corolla will be back in episode 2 of Project Crunchyrolla. Stop and go.